I'm going to say good morning to everybody.
Good
Good
morning.
morning, Rabbi.
Always one last thing to look up. So I'm going to welcome everybody. It's now 10:01, and I want to welcome everybody to Psalm 49. And the key question that I'll look to explore with you is, of all the Psalms, why did our rabbis pick Psalm 49 as the psalm to recite at a house of mourning? It gets recited in both the morning and in the evening. So here's a thought before I begin, and that is Sumner Redstone passed away yesterday, last night. It's the news this morning. I mention it because here's a man who was blessed to live a long life. He lived to 97 with immense wealth, having turned his family's drive-in movie chain into one of the great media empires controlling Viacom and CBS. And yet, despite his wealth, despite longevity, the punchline of this sermon applies to him and to each of us, which is, none of us will get out of here alive. And what will endure in the aftermath of our life is not our wealth, but what we do with our wealth, and even more, what we do with our lives and how we're remembered. And so that's the key theme of Psalm 49. None of us will get out alive. Some things to note before I read the psalm, and that is, this will be, for now, the last of the Korach Psalms. We began with Psalm 42, now 7 psalms that are identified as composed by the sons of Korach. We'll get 4 more of those Korach psalms in the middle of the 80s, 84, 85, 87, and 88. And these psalms, the psalms of Korach, are identified with remarkable word plays, resonances of Bible. They are artistically composed. But for the early commentators, the classic commentators of Psalms, there's often the question, how does the content of a psalm relate to their father or their ancestor, to Korach? And so a Yiddish saying that my teacher, Rabbi Jack Reamer, shared with me when I said I was going to be teaching Psalm 49, Azoi racht v'korach, as rich as Korach. Now, I did some research, and this idea that Korach was a very wealthy man, you may recall Korach was Moses' cousin, who in the Bible will lead a rebellion against Moses, saying, we're all holy people, who put you over us? And in the Talmud, Pesachim 119a, they have a comment on a line from Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, which reads as follows: Solomon once said, there is a sickening evil that I have seen under the sun, riches hoarded by their owner to his misfortune. And then comments, who is this referring to? It's to Korach, who was considered enormously wealthy, who hoarded, and it was to his misfortune. And Rashi will comment that his unrealistic ambitions were what would lead to his downfall. And so in this case, I return now to the question of, why is this the psalm that the rabbis chose for a house of mourning? And I would suggest one reason up front, though we'll come back at the end and I'll suggest others. And that's to say, even when you mourn for somebody, know that who you are, if they were a parent, doesn't dictate who you are. parents clearly make an impact on each of us. At the same time, our values, our choices of how we would wish to live our lives is our choice. And so, even though this psalm was written by the sons of Korach, I should say not even though, precisely because it was written by the sons of Korach, the lesson up front is regardless of where we come from, our lives are ours to lead. And in a moment of loss of a loved one, we are reminded that we are to learn from their life, but it can also be to learn the negative as well as the positive, and it's for us to choose. With that, let me post the psalm and read it. As I say, this is an artistic psalm, which also means lots of double entendres or very different ways that the translations will understand the psalm. I chose a line from the psalm, which is I tend to do, but I'll even point out up front, this is a line that gets repeated in splendor without understanding. And the play on words here is splendor. Is the in splendor referred to a life in splendor, meaning in wealth? Or is the splendor being referred to that our souls are a gift of splendor? They are the gift of creation in the image of God. And yet, despite that splendor, there are those who live without understanding. Well, we'll return to both the title and to unpacking a bit of this psalm. I will point out a little bit of structure, only so that it doesn't all kind of flow together. That's to say that verses 1 to 5 are an introduction, and then verses 6 to 13 shift the focus to a teaching about what it means, a critique of wealth as enabling foolishness. And then verses 14, more or less to the end, which is the expression that wealth is only a temporary advantage in that we're all bound for the pit. We're all bound for death. Okay, let me first share the reading and then go back and share some of the challenges of both translation and the meaning of the psalm. Psalm 49, in splendor without understanding. For the conductor, for the sons of Korach, a psalm. Hear this, all peoples. Give ear, all dwellers of the world. Also descendants of Adam, also any important person, together rich and poor. My mouth will speak wisdom, and the meditation of my heart's understanding. I incline my ear to a wisdom saying. I open with the lyre my riddle. What should I fear in bad days? The encircling iniquities of those who would supplant me. Those who trust in their wealth and whose immense riches they praise themselves, yet they surely will not redeem an important person or give to God a ransom. For too costly is the redemption of their soul, and it will cease forever. Will he live for eternity and never see the pit? Lo yireh hashachat? For one sees that the wise die, equally the fool and the boor perish and leave to others their wealth. Their inner thought is that their home is forever, their dwelling place is for generation to generation. Their names had been proclaimed throughout the lands, but a human in splendor will not rest. He will be like the beasts that are silenced. This way of theirs is their folly, and the end of them who with their own words are pleased. Selah. Like sheep to Sheol they are destined. Death shepherds them, and the upright shall rule over them in the morning, and they wear out their image in Sheol, a trash heap for them. But God will redeem my soul from the hand of Sheol, for God shall take me, Selah. Do not fear when an important person becomes rich, when enlarging glory of his house, for in his death he will not take anything, nor descending behind him will be his glory. For his own soul in his lifetime he blesses. Praised you, for you do well for yourself. He shall come to the generation of his ancestors. Until eternity, they will not see the light. A human in splendor without understanding is likened to beasts that are silenced. Well, a strong psalm, and at first impression, it's a bit baffling because it's a psalm for Shiva that says essentially, if you die rich, at least on the surface reading, it's not going to do you any good. And that sounds kind of depressing. So we'll start from the beginning. Shimu zot kol ha'amim, hear this all peoples, incline your ears all dwellers of Chalad. So hear this all peoples. Now that kind of parallelism can be for emphasis, but for many commentators, there's a sense of building rather than simply repeating. Shimu is understood by the medieval commentator Radak as to hear at large, and then to incline one's ears to, if you will, lean in, to listen more closely. Verse 3, again, this could be simply repetition, but distinctions are made. Gam b'nei Adam, also the children of Adam. Gam b'nei Ish, also the child of a man. Now, frankly, the commentators have a desire to distinguish between these two and will distinguish them in opposite ways. So some will see Adam as the distinguished person, though more commonly, and I choose to see B'nai Ish, like Samson Raphael Hirsch, the 19th century German commentator, Ish, a man, as a man of distinction, an important person. So it is said of Noach that he was Ish Tzaddik, a righteous man, or Yaakov, Ish Tam, a man of integrity, or Moses will be referred to when he has left the people and is on Mount Sinai, Ha'ish Moshe, that man Moshe. And so the word Ish, I'll circle it, will come up again later. And here I identify the rich person as the Ish, the important person, while Adam, we're all children of Adam, hence together rich and poor. My mouth will speak wisdom, and the meditation of my heart's understanding. Circle the word understanding, the last word, tivunot, because that will be the word that'll have the same root in the final verse in terms of those who lack understanding. I incline my ear to a wisdom saying. That's mashal. In Hebrew, Proverbs is called mishle, this same word. Some will do it as parable. I translate it as a wisdom saying. And now I open with the lyre, the harp, my riddle. Those words, mashal and chidati, are words that occur in Proverbs, in Mishle, for wisdom literature. This psalm is not a prayer per se, it's a wisdom teaching. And in that regard, what is unique is the identifying an instrument as an element of the teaching of a riddle or of wisdom. Although the Talmud will say, and this is more of an aside, Shabbat 30b, that sacred music lifts the soul to the divine. But here in verse 5, I open with the harp, with the lyre, chidati, my riddle, and circle again the word riddle, because that is what he will look to solve. Again, the riddle is death itself and who survives. And now he goes personal. The word, again, I will appear, as is the case in the beginning, and this is in transition. Why should I fear in bad days the encircling iniquities of those who would supplant me? Now, that's a choice. The other way that second half of this clause is understood, like in the art scroll, why should I fear in bad days the sin I trod upon that surrounds me? So there's ambiguity. If it's his own sin, and the word Akev, like the word Yaakov, the name Jacob, can mean heal or to supplant. It can also imply that which gets walked upon and, if you will, ignored, which is how Samson Raphael Hirsch, again, that same commentator, for I have disregarded the trivial. So it can either refer, and that's the ambiguity in the Hebrew, you don't know who the pronouns are referring to. Is it referring to the other person or to oneself? Verse 7, those who trust in their wealth and in whose immense riches, here too, they praise themselves. An ambiguous phrase, but I'll leave it at that because it flows for me. They praise themselves. It can either also be understood that they will be worthy of praise if they, elliptically, if they change. Verse 8. Here's another example of ambiguity. The first word, ach, can be brother. So it can be translated as a brother he will not redeem. He will not redeem such a person. He will not give to God a ransom. But ach can not only be brother, it can be yet or even though. So ambiguity. For too costly is the redemption of their soul, and it will cease forever. For he will live in eternity and never see the pit. For one sees that the wise die. Anyone can know that, as Redstone, who, by the way, his original family name was Rothstein. His father, with his encouragement, changed the family name from Redstone to Rothstein. So even the wealthiest, they too will die. And the wise die, the fools die, the boors die. But here's the catch. The catch is in Ecclesiastes. There is the statement, there is no better fate for an animal than for a human. In this psalm, in Psalm 49, there's a distinction made between humans. Some humans may yet survive. Verse 12, their inner thought, this is the wealthy, is that their home is forever. They're going to live forever. Their dwelling places, they're going to endure. Their estates, their inheritance, generation to generation. And their names have been proclaimed throughout the land. That's widely commented as they build memorials to themselves. And there's actually, in Midrash Rabbah, the examples given in that regard, that the Roman emperor built Tiberius for his own name, Alexander the Greek named as Alexandria, Antiochus Epiphanes of the Hanukkah story, he's Antioch in, named the city for himself. But even though these cities are named, they too shall perish. And now the answer, but a human in splendor will not rest. That's the word that the same sentence as the closing sentence, and in that sense ends this next section, verse 13. But there's going to be one letter different. A person, a human, in splendor, but again, with the ambiguity, is the splendor riches or is the splendor the gift of the soul? Bal Yalin, will not rest. In Hebrew, usually in the Bible, the word Yalin is to sleep for a night. So here, poetically, the choice of words is, even in splendor, you will not rest, but even then know that your resting is only temporary. And your life, when you die, is no different than the beasts of the field, for all, in this case, will be silenced. This way of theirs is their folly, the end of them who with their own words are pleased. Here is something unique in Psalm 15, namely a description of the afterlife. In Psalms, we get these words, shachad or Sheol, most commonly Sheol. We've seen it before. Sheol is the grave, but Sheol can also be the netherworld. But we don't learn anything about the netherworld usually. And here in this Psalm of Korach, Robert Alter will say that this is unprecedented. Here's two things that are of interest. Like sheep to Sheol, they are destined. So everybody, is going to the same place. Death shepherds them. Now, a personification of death as the shepherd. That's also distinctive, but this is the key piece. And the upright, Yesharim, those who are straight, who are honest, who've lived with integrity, shall rule over them. Them are the ones who are foolish, who will rule over them in the morning. They wear out their image in Sheol. Now this is back to the foolish people. A trash heap for them. Mizvul lo. There too, a choice of translations. Some would see Zvul as simply a place of habitation. All the more in modern Hebrew, Zevel is trash, and that seems like the right emphasis. But the idea that those who are righteous, they will rule over those who are not. That will later find a place in the Talmud with the description of those who are wicked. They will be at the feet of the righteous, or their ashes will be at the feet of the righteous. And so this verse 15, will become a pivotal verse later for the rabbis describing the afterlife, but in a context in which the Bible says very little about Sheol and reward and punishment in that place. So verse 15 is also linked. Why this psalm for a house of mourning? Because here reward is promised for those who are upright. But God will redeem my soul from the hands of Sheol. So here 16 is the answer to the riddle. Ach, but God will redeem my soul from the hand of Sheol, for God shall take me. Which is to say, back to why this psalm, not everybody, in contra to Ecclesiastes, will necessarily be, if you will, obliterated in Sheol. Though some would translate or understand this to mean my life will be lengthened or preserved. And do not fear, for an important person becomes rich when enlarging glory of his house. So don't fear that your life is meaningless, building off verse 16. For even though around you you see people who are wealthy and seem to be doing well, which is the key religious question, why do those people prosper who aren't necessarily good people? He will say here, know that their prosperity, their riches, their comforts are transient. For in his death, he will not take anything. You don't take anything with you. Verse 18, nor descending behind him will be his glory. For his own soul in his lifetime he praises. This again is a choice of translations. The Art Scroll will say for the second half of verse 19, others will bless you if you improve yourself, opening up the possibility of teshuvah, of repentance. But this seems, because it's ambiguous, can be self-referential. He's now praising himself, this person who lacks wisdom. For you do well for yourself. And now verse 20, he shall come to the generation of his ancestors. Until eternity, they will not see the light, which is to say, because they're foolish, they're going to remain in Sheol, which for the latter rabbis will also point to the rewards, both of the afterlife, but even to resurrection of the dead, when those will be reborn. That's not necessarily the intention of the Psalter, but this psalm will be very important as a reading of the afterlife for the rabbis of later generations. And now the closing line. And remember, 13 is exactly these words, but one letter different. That's the fourth word. Instead of a bet here, it'll be a lamed. So a human in splendor without understanding. Before it was a human in splendor without rest, is likened to beasts that are silenced. Rashi, the great biblical commentator, 11th century, says, in regarding no understanding, that they have no understanding because they've put all their emphasis on material possessions, and their lack of wisdom leads them to forego the offer of God's protection in the world to come. You may remember our last line of Psalm 48 was, Hu yenhagenu al mut, that God will lead that righteous person either to death or even, as I translated based on other translators, beyond death. And here, a human in splendor without understanding, if you lack the capacity or you choose not to understand what matters in life and simply invest in the material, your life is no different than a beast of the field who's identified without human wisdom, godlike understanding, and thereby your life leads to obliteration, need mu, to silence. Two concluding thoughts. In Ecclesiastes, chapter 2, verses 11 to 17, are the following words. Then my thoughts turned to all the fortune my hands had built up, to the wealth I had acquired and won. And oh, it was all futile and pursuit of wind. There was no real value under the sun. For what will a person be like who succeeds? The one who is ruling over what was built up long ago? Now skipping to verse 15. So I reflected, the fate of the fool is also destined for me. To what advantage then have I been wise? So the idea of it is foolish to think that the pursuit of the material is of enduring value is part of Ecclesiastes. Closing thought, two things to know. This is the psalm also for the parsha in which one is asked to make a financial contribution, Parsha Shkalim, for the communal needs of worship. Again, the emphasis, part from your material possessions, for they will not ultimately define you. Ernest Becker was a cultural anthropologist who published a book in 1973 called The Denial of Death. It would earn the Pulitzer Prize the following year, 1974, 2 months after the author's death. Ernest Becker, in The Denial of Death, says, in reassessing what drives humans, and he examines Sigmund Freud's writing and Erickson's writings, and he says that the human tendency is to fear the unknown of death as a loss of control and as the fear of obliteration. And so that what drives people most powerfully is trying to overcome the fear of death. And he called his book The Denial of Death. So he says most people accumulate possessions or seek power in order to feel in this narrow way as if they are in control of their fate, and thereby ignore the reality that ultimately they will die. And so all those efforts, Ernest Becker said, are for naught because we will die. And the punchline of the book is death is part of life, and to try and ignore it is to waste a lot of energy, not only in terms of how we spend time, but psychically, and that to accept death as part of life is to live life with one's energy better focused on what matters. So with that, let me gain your reactions, and we'll come back in my summing up why this is the Psalm of the House of Mourning. Any thoughts in this regard? It's a delight to see my cousin Marcus on. Initially, I didn't recognize you, Mark, with the goatee, but a treat to see you. Any reactions to this particular psalm? Let me pull up the screen where I can see everybody. It's wonderful that we have 26. 26 in Gematria is the name for the divine, Yud He Vav He. So we're having a conversation about ultimate realities here. Anybody have a question or a comment? Phyllis, who I will pause to acknowledge, is in the month of the mourning of her mother, blessed to live to the age of 93.
Yeah, it's as I sit there, I'm looking at my sister Sharon, who's in New Jersey at our mom's apartment. She's waving at me. And what I find resonant about this is that it gives additional meaning to the phrase, you can't take it with you. And it reminds us again that, there was a line, one of my favorite movies is Moonstruck. And Olivia Dukakis says to her husband, no matter how much money you make, you're still going to die. At the end of the day, it's nice to be recognized. It's nice to have money to live comfortably and be able to help others. But at the end of the day, it's the end is still going to happen no matter what. It's just a nice reminder. Ironic that you do this at a house of mourning, but in some sense, a poetically nice connection.
Yeah, and literally that line, you can't take it with you, is verse 18. Ki lo v'moto yikach hakol, for in death you will not take anything. So, if you want to know, you can say it's as ancient as Psalms, or probably more ancient than that, the recognition that when you die, though in antiquity, as we do know, particularly, in Sumeria, there was this wonderful exhibit at the Bowers Museum years ago on death rites of Sumeria, which is where Abraham comes from, Ur Kasdim. And these elaborate rituals of killing all the slaves to send with the king into the netherworld. You get that as well in Egyptian culture, which was this obsession with death. and the sense that you could take your power with you. But in contrast, and here's the thing that is quite remarkable in the biblical wisdom tradition, in many ways it's a rejection of the death worship of Egypt, where the afterlife was the goal of religion. And not that it's the same, but in Christianity too, the image of Jesus on the cross puts a lot of focus on death as the nature of religion, so that in Christianity, the reward of the afterlife becomes the purpose of religion in a very significant way. In Judaism and in the writings of the rabbi, in the Bible, the great Bible scholar Jacob Milgram, who taught at Berkeley, said that in the Bible, the priest, when a priest brought offerings, did so in silence. There was no incantation, and more, if a priest had contact with the dead, the priest became unclean and could not perform rituals until a process of ritual cleansing, which was to say the rejection of the Egyptian religious focus on death and the power of the priest as the emissary to be the bridge to an afterlife was rejected in the Bible. The priest had no hidden powers in the Bible. The priest had no incantations that were esoteric. The priest, in fact, could not even engage in burial unless it was an immediate family member. So strong was the need to separate life and death and God as a source of life. So this psalm is a part of that. The notion that, death is not a place you're going to take things with you other than your own righteousness. And God, and that's the distinctive part of this psalm, will recognize distinction making between the righteous and those who were hedonistic and failed to understand. And that's that closing play. It's so, again, poetically remarkable. Yalin and Yavin, verse 13 at the center of this psalm and the closing line are only different by one letter. You who rest in this world, who abide in this world, Yalin, only if you are Yavin, only if you have understanding, will you have God's reward. Again, I've read these Psalms and I've never paused as now to see how artful they are, really artful in conveying something core and profound.
Rabbi, I have a comment.
Okay, Mike,
if I may quickly.
Go ahead.
Right from the very beginning, the first two verses struck me as odd. One, this is written by the descendant of Korach, the same people that a few Psalms ago were complaining they're not treated well and they're kind of second-class citizens and God continues to punish them, and so do the people. And yet in verse 2, somewhere between arrogance and chutzpah, they have a message to the entire people of all the nations and the people of this decaying earth. So here are the people that are considering themselves second-class citizens, have a message for the world. I thought it was somewhere close to chutzpah or arrogance.
So there's a beautiful insight there, Mike, that I'd like to play with in a certain way. Korach's challenge to Moses is the words of a demagogue. He's the demagogue in the Bible, and it's magnificent to read that carefully in terms of an unpacking or a evocation of what a demagogue sounds like. And what he says is, Moses, who put you over us? All of us are holy. We're a holy people. We don't need you to tell us what to do, right? Because we're all holy. And the great scholar Yeshayahu Leibovitz, who taught the history of science at Hebrew University and also did writings on Jewish text, he said, the paragraph right before Korach's statement is the statement that we chant as the third paragraph of the Shema that says you should wear fringes on the four corners of your garments. And it says, V'yitem kroshim le'Elohechem, and you shall be holy. So Yeshayahu Leibovitz said, the religious quest is always in the future. You're never holy. It's not a status. It's an aspiration. Greatness is never something you are. It's what you aspire to be, or in this case, holiness. And the demagogue turned it. The demagogue Korach said, we are holy. There are no distinctions to make between us. And the irony here, building on your insight, Mike, of Korach's sons is to say, my father was wrong. There are distinctions to be made between people based on not their riches, but on their understanding of what really matters in life, on their faithfulness, on their integrity, and not all people are the same. That holiness is an aspiration worthy of aspiration. So thank you, Mike. That adds another layer of the irony that it's a teaching of Korach's sons. With that, knowing there is so much more to say, but more to do in the course of a day, I invite those who have Kaddish to recite to do so. As in our answering Amen, we have the privilege to fulfill a mitzvah of honoring those who are deceased. Yitkadal v'yitkadash
Kadal v'yikadash me rabba.
V'alma
V'alma
divra
divra
yurte
yurte.
Yamlich
Yamlich
malchute
malchute.
V'chayechon
V'chayechon
yomechon
v'yamechon.
Chayei
V'chayed
dechol
dechol
Beit
bet Yisrael.
Yisrael Ba'agala
V'galav
v'zman
v'zman kariv.
kariv v'imru
V'imru
amen
amen.
Yehesh
Yesh
Rabba
rabba mezarach.
Mezorach Leolam
Elam
Omeo
olamei
Maya
amaya.
Yitbarach
Yibarach
v'yishtabach
v'yishtabach. V'yita'ar.
v'yita'ar v'yitrovah
V'yitruman v'yitnaseh.
Nase v'yitadar
V'yitadar v'yitaleh.
v'yitala
Yitaleh. Shmei Kedusha.
Uvra
Brichu.
Berechu Le'ela
Leila
min
min kol
birchata
berchata.
v'shirata
V'shirata. Tushbechata.
Tata v'nechemata
Nechemata.
da'amiran
Damiran
Noma
bi'ama.
v'imru
V'imru
amen
amen.
Yehesh
Ish
Lama
lama
Rabba
rabba.
min
Min
Shemaya
shmaya.
v'chayim
V'chaim aleinu v'yakol
Yaakov
Yisrael.
Yisrael v'imru
V'imru
amen.
amen.
Oseh
Oseh shalom
Shalom
b'mromav.
b'romav Hu
Hu
Yaseh Shalom
yaseh shalom.
Aleinu
Aleinu v'yakol
v'Yakol
Yisrael.
Yisrael v'Kol
Kol
Yoshvei
yoshvei
Tevel
tevel. V'imru
v'imru
amen.
amen. Again, thanks to all. Next week, we will only have one psalm, and that's Psalm 50, and we're going to stop with Psalm 50 until after Yom Kippur. I will celebrate with you 1/3 through the Psalms. What I've gained from looking at the Psalms carefully is their artistry, but also how every Psalm so far has been distinctive. It's really been fascinating and spiritually uplifting to do so. Psalm 50, Coming Attractions, is a new author, Asaph, who's identified in Chronicles, meaning very early on, as one of the Levitical singers, but he's also in Psalm 50 in the role of prophet. Sometimes later writers would make a distinction between the priests, who were seen more as clerics, officiants, and the priests who were challenging authority. One aligned with authority, the other challenging authority. But we'll see with Psalm 50, Asaph, who will be an important writer of Psalms, will be a singer who is a challenger at the same time, psalmist and prophet. I look to do that with you next Tuesday. Thank you for, again, giving me added energy as I begin my day.